Uh, I have now shared this this broadcast to Facebook. So I'm sure we will have some folks joining us. Actually, I need to go over and click one thing. Okay. All right. Now we are almost live.
There we are.
You see us
Hey.
on Facebook?
Hey, good to see
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Good evening. Good evening.
This way. This way, more. There you go. You're right here. See that?
So I just wanted to check and make sure.
Hello, California.
Hello.
So I am going to welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for everyone who is joining us on Facebook Live. I want y'all to know, because I think we had some folks post some comments on Facebook Live. I'm not able to monitor that and Zoom at the same time. So unfortunately, I'm not able to look at comments in real time on Facebook, but if you post a comment there, I promise this time we'll respond as we're able going forward. I'm also right now, I'm going to mute everybody who is who's joining us on Zoom. And then I'm going to unmute Jim, because that would be a very one-sided conversation if I didn't.
Isn't that your dream, OJ, to be able to meet Jim?
There are some things that I've meant to talk to you about, Jim. So, welcome, Jim. And when Jim and I will have a conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor and let y'all ask your questions or enter the conversation in whatever way you feel called at that time. And I am going to spotlight your video, Jim. So at the moment, you will be the featured face on our conversation, but we'll come back to you. I don't know. I'm going to try something. Nope. I wanted to put the two of us side by side, but that's another thing for another time. So just by way of a real quick introduction, Jim and I both went through the ordination process in the Diocese of Western North Carolina together. Jim had already attended seminary at a school somewhere in North Carolina, I think. And so after, once we both got to the point where we would attend seminary, Jim and I both attended seminary of the Southwest in Austin, but Jim was there for 1 year as an Anglican study student, whereas I was there for 3 years. And then he returned to the Diocese of Western North Carolina and served St. Mary's and St. Stephen's in Morganton, North Carolina, which is a congregation. It's two parishes which merged, one a historically Black congregation and one a historically white congregation. They merged and now worship and their life is together. And then moved, just about a year ago, Jim moved to Oakland, California, where he now serves St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, which is a historically Black congregation there. So did I leave anything out, Jim?
I mean, my life is a lot longer and more complicated, but everything you said is true.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're a complex guy, so.
Jay and I go way back, so we might prod each other a little bit. You guys will have to put up with. Hopefully, you'll still learn something in the midst of it.
From Jim, anyway. So I guess, I mean, this is a pretty big question, and there may be, it may be that there are a couple of specific instances that come to mind for you, Jim. But I wonder, as a white person and as a white pastor, what have been maybe a couple of the biggest surprises, awakenings, however you want to term it, of serving congregations that are filled with people of color? What did you find out that you didn't know before or anticipate?
Yeah. Well, again, greetings, everyone, and thank you. It's an honor to be able to, kind of revisit the Diocese of Western North Carolina. There are times when I deeply miss that place, and it's a beautiful location. I guess I would go back and just say I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and I grew up in one called Rolling Meadows, which sounds really pleasant. And when I went to high school, my public high school had 2,500 students. And I remember one year hearing that 13 students at the school were Black, which is 0.5%. But it's Chicago, right? It's the Chicago area. There's lots of Black people around, but just not where I lived. And so looking back, that was very intentional. Right? Like that didn't just, whoa, this just kind of happened. This is the way it is. Like that was very intentional in the late 60s as riots were happening and as the city was doing what it was doing. White people left the cities, including my parents who had grown up in the Swedish neighborhood in Chicago. I'm 100% Swedish. Moved to the suburbs because that's where all the white people were going. And the fact that I grew up in a place that was predominantly white, or if there were people of color, it was like engineers at Motorola who were from India. Like I had friends whose parents were from India and stuff, or Korea or Japan, but I didn't have any friends that were Black. And again, that was structural and that was intentional. And so just kind of reckoning with, like, for me, I just didn't grow up around Black people. So I was like, how can I be racist if I didn't grow up around Black people? And yet I grew up in a very racist structure. And, property taxes pay for school. So the public high school I went to is one of the top rated public high schools in the state of Illinois, and even kind of in the nation. And yet it's a public school. And there's public schools in Chicago that are predominantly Black that I think might not offer English all 4 years of high school, and 4 years of English is a requirement for going to college, right? Mm-hmm. So like the structures were there, and I bring all this up to give you a little background of my history, to acknowledge that the North is just as racist as the South, but also to point out the structures that I grew up in that I was just totally unaware of. And so being a priest to Black people meant I had to get some education and learning on how to be a good priest to Black people, because our seminaries train us to be priests to white people. Our church is 92% white. And so it's just kind of part of the structure and part of the system. And really it was like reckoning with my own privilege, again, whether I asked for it or not, and just all the subtle ways that it like permeates who I am and how I approach the world and how I interact with the world, and just needing to reckon with that as a priest and preaching to Black people who are not part of the dominant culture. So like a subtle way that plays out, right? when I went to seminary the first time in Durham, North Carolina, I guess Jay doesn't want me to name the school. Um, I just don't, I'm not from the South. I don't like to dress nice. And I also don't like consumerism. And so I would wear clothes long after I should have thrown them away, sometimes with holes in them, you know, and I'd have like jeans that were old and kind of ratty. And I realized that my classmates who were Black would all dress nice. And I was always confused. I'm like, why are you dressing so nice? That looks so uncomfortable. We're just students. Like, you know, but then I realized that at that school, all of the janitors and housekeepers and cafeteria workers were Black. And if my Black classmates dressed like me, everyone would think they were the janitor and not a student in the divinity school. Whereas I, being blonde haired, blue eyed, no one ever was like, what are you doing here? Show me your ID. Do you even belong here? Even though there were days where I might have looked like I was homeless, right? Like, so those are like subtle ways where I could just be who I wanted to be in the world and not really have to worry about consequences where like Black people have to worry about those things. Yeah.
So, I mean, one set of things you're talking about are things that almost form like, you know, if we're fish in the fishbowl, I mean, they're just the fishbowl. You know,
Right.
they are the
Yeah.
water in which we swim. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I think just the big picture being a priest to Black people is just kind of acknowledging that, like, we are different. We are treated differently in America, and I'm not even fully aware of all the ways that I am behaving that are just foreign to you.
And sometimes it takes somebody who's outside of that particular aquarium to say, you know, your aquarium's a lot nicer than mine, right?
But yes, and even like reading books that say that too, right? Like I like to listen to podcasts, I like to watch movies, I like to read books. So then it was like, all right, one day, like 4 or 5 years ago, I just Googled what are the top 5 podcasts by Black people. And lo and behold, there's a whole list. And I started listening to podcasts by Black people. I started reading books about Black history and white privilege and racism and all that stuff. So, yeah. Anyway.
And what you're describing, a lot of what you're describing is, I guess, what is defined as structural racism. You know, that the institutions, their policies, public policy, you know, financial, economic structures that are maybe bigger than any one individual.
Yeah, for sure. I'll tell you. I'll just tell you quick. Hopefully, it'll be quick. But the stories of my 2 grandfathers. My one grandfather was older when he had my dad, and then my dad was older when he had me. So my grandfather was born in 1904 in Sweden, and he immigrated to America when he was 18 in 1922. Was allowed to immigrate because he was Swedish, so he was white. So when he got to Staten Island or Ellis Island, they were like, do you have lice? And he was like, no. They're like, you're good to go, right? If he was Black or Latinx, they would have been like, no, sorry, you got to get out of here.
Do you have lice, by the way? Or have you held up that family?
Right. Yeah, he did not,
yeah.
I don't think, because that's never been part of the family story. But then he goes to Chicago, goes to the Swedish neighborhood, and he probably had a 6th grade education, but was trained in tool and die, metal spinning, metal stamping and stuff. And he got a job for a guy where my grandpa was the only employee, and he was doing all the work, whereas the other guy was the boss. And during the Great Depression, my grandpa's boss said, man, I got to pay you with IOUs because our one client is paying me with IOUs. And then like a couple of weeks later, the client comes and was like, hey, I need you to make this other part. Where's the boss? He's like, the boss is out of town. And the guy was like, well, I need this. Can you make this? My grandpa's like, yeah, I think we could do it. We could do this. And he was, all right, well, I'll pay cash, right? Like I do the other time. And my grandpa was like, what, cash? He told me you were paying an IOU. He's been paying me an IOU. I haven't been getting paid. I'm the one doing all the work. And then the customer was like, well, if you want to start your own business, I'll buy from you. I don't care. If you're the one doing all the work, I'll buy from you. And so my grandfather, you know, being a Swedish immigrant, was able to get a loan, was able to get this guy's confidence because he was white, and was able to get a loan from a bank because he was white. And he started his own business in the midst of the Great Depression in 1933. And then in the post-World War II boom, did pretty well. Not like millions and millions, but like he made a good living. Yeah, and then he worked really hard. I don't want to diminish that. And he was fortunate to be white, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of want to highlight both of those things. And then my other grandfather was born in 1921 in the Swedish neighborhood in Chicago, ended up serving in World War II and came home, and with the GI Bill was able to go to college. And then he graduated from college, had been married and had my mom already, and got a job with like the Department of Transportation in Illinois, and a year or two later was able to buy a home. So the GI Bill was really only available to white veterans because there weren't a lot of colleges that were accepting black people. And at one point, the GI Bill after World War II consumed 20% of the federal government's budget. Think of how many billions of dollars that would be today. And it was basically all going to white people. And then when my grandfather went to buy a home, there were I'm still reading that book, The Color of Law. I haven't gotten to that part yet. But there were all these programs for veterans to buy homes and all these benefits to help you buy homes. So he was able to buy a home, again, because he was white and was a veteran. Whereas black people were redlined. They weren't allowed to buy homes. No bank would give them a mortgage. And they were often squeezed into specific black neighborhoods and charged exorbitant rent. And even when, oftentimes, especially in Chicago, when they would buy a home, it would be with a fraudulent mortgage. And after paying mortgage for 30 years, at the end, they'd find out they'd been swindled and they actually didn't own their home. So again, and my grandfather worked really hard his whole life, was really great. Ended up being a missionary for a couple years in Venezuela after he retired, even though he and grandma didn't speak a lick of Spanish. They're pretty fun and adventurous people. But again, so that's both of my grandparents worked really hard and also were able to accumulate wealth by buying a home and by starting their own business because they were white. Those options were not available to black people at that time. So.
Well, and that's, I guess, what we commonly hear called white privilege. And that seems to me like one of those things that is difficult for us who have always swimmed. The past tense of having gone swimming.
I think it's swimmed.
Swimmed. Okay.
It's not at all swimmed, but let's go with it.
Yeah. Those of us
we'll
who
make
have
the English teachers in the group cringe.
Yeah, those of us who have swimmed in that fishbowl would I mean, sometimes the kinds of things that you describe, like deeds or neighborhood covenants that restrict ownership to whites only, on the one hand, those sound like utterly impossible to me that something like that could happen. But on the other hand, but for families of color, it's like it absolutely happened. And that absolutely still happens, maybe not by legal means. So I guess that's one of those perspective shifts that education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to see that play out today, just real quick, that in America today, the average net worth of a white high school dropout is higher than the average net worth of an African-American college graduate.
Right.
So that stat just should infuriate all of us.
Right. Well, and so I guess that brings me around to the question of when we get into these conversations, a lot of times, you know, and I have felt this in the past myself, you know, we'll have these conversations and I'll say, whoa, wait a minute. I'm not a racist. You know, I don't have a belief that this person is less human than I am or something like that. But I, you know, on the one hand, I certainly have benefited from the systems you described. And there's a distinction, right? Like between my personal kind of understanding and those systems that we all participate in.
Yeah. I mean, yes, yeah. And so one of the questions you emailed me about was what's the difference between like racial prejudice,
Right.
and prejudice is like, we all have prejudice, right? Like right now I'm prejudiced against having long hair. I don't like it. It's annoying. It takes up a lot, you know. We all have prejudices, and that's just like normal to being human, right? But then our racial prejudices, the difference there is then racism is inherently linked with power, right? And so like, if I don't like men with long hair, that's fine, but structurally and systematically, that's not gonna like oppress them and make them more likely to end up in jail and diminish their net worth, and, you know, make them have less opportunity in life. But when we're prejudiced against our prejudice that is inherent, I think we've all learned it by living in America, means we do participate in these structures in ways where we don't ask questions, and in ways that it really benefits us. And we blind ourselves to the way it harms other people. So
right. But there is, I mean, as you say, there's a personal level of prejudice that might be applied to all sorts of things, and in some situations is well, I mean, it's to a certain extent grows out of instinctual behavior, like to protect ourselves and that sort of thing, you know, but then gets, you know, we could talk C.S. Lewis all day long about our natural instincts being warped, you know, beyond their usefulness.
Yeah.
But there's the level of personal prejudice and personal racial prejudice, and that's tied to, but, you know, distinct thing from institutional racism. And you've talked in that milieu too about, you know, kind of the ways that our institutions privilege white people, which doesn't mean that we don't, some of us don't work very hard or face difficult challenges, but there are just certain advantages that always pertain to us. But there's one other aspect I want to be sure that we talk about, because this one for me, I think, has been a more recent sort of, oh, now I understand. And that's the issue of racial superiority or white supremacy, you know. And I'll give an example of this, because growing up in the South, you know, white supremacists were the people with the hoods, you know.
Right.
White supremacists were the people who acted violently against Black people and against people of color. But I had a very, my assumption was that in the South, because of Jim Crow laws, that education for Black people in the South was inferior to education, and Black people were less intelligent than white people because of the educational systems. And as far as the facilities, material circumstances, all of that is true in terms of inferior facilities, inferior funding, and so forth. But it's in the last 5 years or so that I found that all of the teachers at the Black high school, Stevens Lee High School in Asheville, many of them had been educated at Columbia College in New York, Columbia Teachers College. Well, part of that makes it they could not attend colleges in the South, number one. But number two, that meant that all of the or much of the faculty of Stevens Lee High School was Ivy League trained. And the stories of the students who came out of there, and of course, all of the students had to be twice as good, perform twice as hard because of the structural stuff we've talked about. But the result is that their students were very highly educated. And I think it is a sort of a function of white supremacy that I just naturally assumed, okay, the white education was, of course it was going to be better, So I don't know if you have examples of that kind of distinction. I mean,
well, yeah. So one of my classmates from when I was in the seminary in Durham is now a professor at McAfee Divinity School. And she actually performed my wedding when my wife and I got married. Her name is Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes. And she wrote an amazing book you should all read. I'm trying to remember the title. It's in the other room. But anyway, I'll get it in a minute. But she has this great quote about white supremacy that I'll read. The cornerstone of white supremacy is the notion that white people and the culture that they produce are the hegemonic ideal and thus represent the gold standard by which all other peoples and cultures should be adjudicated.
Right. So another way of saying that may be that, there's a question, or there has been a question in the past, like where is Africa's Dostoevsky? Why isn't it's like Dostoevsky is Africa's Dostoevsky,
Well, and that definition of white supremacy also reminds me of when we were in seminary in Texas, and the diocese we were in, the Diocese of Texas, however many years ago, had sold a hospital for like $3 billion or something. And just so they're Texans and they're super rich. And there was this culture at the Diocese of Texas that the way we do things in the Diocese of Texas is the right way to do everything. Right, Jay?
That's Texas. I mean, that's
that's Texas,
it's not just
also,
Episcopalians in
right.
Texas. That's Texas as a whole. Yeah.
But there was also that diocese, and they also had $3 billion to back them up and do all these programs. And they would just be like, well, we do it right. And you'd be like, oh, well, in our diocese, we actually do this. You might want to consider it. They're like, oh, isn't that cute?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And that's Texas, but then apply that to broader whiteness and culture where we just assume that what is ours is the gold standard, right? And it permeates us in just so many subtle, crazy ways. So I heard comedian Aziz Ansari once doing stand-up. His parents are from India, and he said after Slumdog Millionaire won the Oscar, all his white friends were like, man, you must feel so good because a film made about people from India won the Oscar. And he was kind of like, I wasn't in the movie. I didn't make any, it doesn't have, and then he said, oh, white people must feel good about themselves all the time because white films are winning Oscars for decades and decades and decades, and you must just walk around feeling great about yourself. So I feel like those are like subtle ways that like white supremacy comes out. That's not like overt, right? Like,
Right.
so they say the iceberg, right? The stuff above water is like the guys in hoods, the guys chanting and marching for whiteness and yelling white power. But all the stuff underwater is those subtle ways, and I do it too. So
Right.
and,
Well, I guess that's an interesting place for us to shift to opening this conversation, is just to say that, you know, you've spent time intentionally studying, educating yourself, working in Black congregations, and as you just say, I mean, you still, like, you're always uncovering something new.
yeah. And my wife is Black, and whenever politicians say something that's racist and get called out, and they're like, "Oh, I can't be racist, I have a Black friend," I would always laugh, because I was like, I have a Black wife, and therefore I know I'm racist because she
Right.
tells me all the way, you know, and I'm working on it. But like, I just because you have a Black whatever doesn't get you that, you know, if they're really your friend, they'll call you out on all the times when your whiteness permeates. And it's really, how do you center things, right? Centering whiteness, centering Blackness, and centering this. So like, I was in Morganton, and I go to the coffee shop in town, and I realized, oh, this is a white space, right? It wasn't designated whites only. It was owned by white people. 85% or more of the people there were white. And when Black people came in, it was great. They were welcome, you know, but they knew they were entering a white space that centered whiteness, catered, you know, was catering to white people. And it was sort of holding up whiteness as the gold standard, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, I'm going to unmute everybody. First, I'll take Jim off of Spotlight, if I can make it do that. And then I will, and then I'll try to take myself off of, there we go. And then let me unmute everybody, and I will invite y'all to offer your questions. You can mute yourself or unmute yourself as you see fit. But one of the things Jim and I talked about, you know, is based on his experience in the Black community. You know, he has some experience and some answers, and is willing to share those, answer the things that we might want to, or think questions we might direct at our Black friends, but maybe isn't really fair to make them ask. So Jim is willing to speak to those from his experience as best that he can. So everything you've ever wanted to know about racism and were afraid to ask, now's the time.
No pressure.
No pressure, exactly.
One thing we've really figured out is that racism is a construct. It doesn't exist. When we were working as priests in Montreal, the racism was against people who spoke French or people who spoke English. And our huge congregation that we had in the Montreal suburbs, when all the white people that had English names got fired and had to leave Quebec and move to English-speaking provinces in the country, our church filled up with Black people and people of color from the Caribbean and from India. Because why? They spoke English. They were brown and Black people, but they spoke English, so they were good. So it's a construct, it's not a thing, you know? And one of the most interesting things was commuting to the University of the South in Tennessee to get our doctorates. And one of the things we did, because I wanted to hear some bluegrass. I'm from Iowa. We don't have that, you know. And so we went to Smithville, Tennessee. I thought that would be a good place. It was a gospel celebration. And you paid your $5 and you got to stand in front of a mic and sing. Well, we sang black gospel. And we're as white as they get. And there was this dead silence after we finished. And so we amused ourselves by going to the Smithville, Tennessee Museum and seeing a pattern that anybody could copy for a Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon uniform. And then afterwards, when we went to the little craft fair that they had, people came coming up and saying to us, "We liked you best." But they didn't dare say it out loud because we were singing black gospel, not white gospel. That was my first experience with how difficult this construct actually is.
Well,
Yeah, and I agree with that. It is it's a construct, and it's a construct that comes with power, right? And so like right now there's all this stuff going on about the police. Well, like way back in the day, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Irish and the Italians were immigrating to America, and they felt like they were Irish and they were Italian, and they got to America and everybody was like, "Oh, you're kind of grubby and dirty and we don't like you." And they had to learn to become white. And so one of the jobs that was available was they could be the police, and the police back then was really keeping black people in line. So they could show that they were white and not necessarily the dirty Irish or dirty Italian. They could show they were acceptable and white and fit into whiteness by policing black people. And that's kind of, you know, one of the histories of the police, but it's also how you see that race is a construct. And when you show up, like my grandfather showed up from Sweden, and it's like, yeah, you got to figure out how to be white. Just like people right now who immigrate from like Nigeria to America, they're like, "I'm Nigerian," and it's like, "No, you're black." What's nice is that because it's a construct, it's something we can unlearn and we can deconstruct, but it requires a whole lot of work. So yeah.
well, and I think the Cornell West has done a lot of great work on how race came to be, how the idea of race came to be. And also, Abigail's reading a book right now. It's like big, thick history book of race, you know, like the idea of racism in this country. And Abigail, who's the author of that?
The author is Dr. Ibram Kendi.
Ibram Kendi. Yeah, yeah. So I think there's, in the last, 50 years, there's been a lot of great scholarship on this, kind of uncovering this history of how ideas about race developed, and how we're coming more and more to understand that, you know, the science of race is pseudoscience. You know, it was never valid to begin with, but has had dramatic implications. So, yeah, that's one of those areas that really offers a lot to somebody who wants to explore it. Yeah.
And Thomas Jefferson wrote, you know, the Declaration of Independence. We believe that all men are created equal. And he also wrote ranking the races, right? So there was like white on top, then like Asian, then Native American, and then black was always at the bottom. And there was a priest, a Spanish priest who came to the New World in the 1500s who he also like ranked the different races, because all of a sudden they came over here and they saw the different races. And yeah, anyway, I could get real nerdy about that, but there's a whole history where, because they were concerned in Spain with not being Jewish, like the anti-Semitism led to them needing to be pure in blood and not Jewish. You got to be Gentile, you know? They carried that same notions of purity. All of a sudden they're in the new world and they're encountering all these different races and tribes they never really experienced. And that purity and racism from that was rooted in anti-Semitism got then applied to the new world. I know it's not supposed to be funny, but in one of his rankings, he put at the bottom people from Florida, and that just kind of made me laugh, because you always hear about like the Florida man, just people doing really dumb things. But anyway, his Florida was very different from our Florida. But anyway,
All
right,
states
yeah.
matter. Yeah. Well, that spurred another thought in my head, but you know, y'all hear me talk all the time, and I want to offer y'all the opportunity to ask some more questions.
I'd like to just say, one of the things you said, Jim, and it's very nice to see you. One of the things you said was that we kind of blind ourselves to how things might be affecting other people. And as we're considering the monuments that we have on our campus at Calvary, I think it's important that we not just think about what is our perspective, our personal perspective, but how might these affect someone else who might be walking through the campus, part of our community, experiencing, seeing those, seeing the information as such that's about the people who are being memorialized there. So I just think I liked what you said about not that we blind ourselves sometimes, and we need to make a conscious effort to understand how things might be affecting other people and other groups of people.
Yeah. When I was in Morganton, that's when I got married, and my wife is a Black woman. And in the center of Morganton is a big monument to Confederate soldiers. And I realized one day that for whatever reason, those guys were fighting Confederacy, right? It was all varied and it was complicated and all that. But the system that would have been upheld if they won meant that my wife could be raped with impunity, right? Because she's a Black woman and she didn't have the rights. And so by putting that memorial up, you're kind of saying, we don't care about Black women's bodies. And I know that's a little crude and extreme, but that's the reality of it, right? Yeah.
Well, and all history, all stories about the past include making choices about what we include and what we don't include.
Right. So like those Black women that were assaulted, where's their story?
And where is, in a sense, I keep coming back to the church that Calvary worships in, and that there are bricks, particularly in the western wall of that church that were formed by hand by enslaved people. That is among many other things, a monument to their work. That is the legacy, but where is their story told? Where are the stories, both of the tragedies, but also of the incredible ways in which the contributions of Black people are fundamental to who we are as a nation, So.
Yeah. And by not telling those stories, you're sort of saying this is a space that centers whiteness, right? Like who are we centering here? And so just as an opposite example, I'm now the white priest of a historically Black church in Oakland, but it's in a neighborhood that's being radically gentrified, right? And so like, now there's a lot of white people living in the neighborhood, whereas 20 years ago, it was a really kind of bad neighborhood. And so the church is trying to figure out, like, how do we be welcoming, but then will we lose our identity? And so one of my goals as a white priest of a Black church is this needs to be a space that centers Blackness, so that we're radically welcoming of everyone. But if you come here, this is a space that centers Blackness, right? And so it means a certain type of white person will be welcome at our church. And I'm not saying Calvary should do that. In fact, you should not. But because you're a different church with a different history.
Mm-hmm.
But when you tell certain stories and you don't tell other stories, you are centering some people's perspective and decentering others, if that makes sense. So
Right.
and it's all
right.
subtle in how that
Yeah.
plays out.
What other questions or comments do y'all have? Jackie, we can't hear you. Well, you are welcome to type something in the chat if you would like, Jackie, since your microphone seems to be on the fritz. If you type something in the chat, we can respond to it there. And
I'll just throw in a question.
yeah,
As a former teacher, I think a lot of us here have some experience in teaching. And I remember once in New Jersey going to a conference about multiculturalism, and Richard Rodriguez was the guest speaker. So we were people who were being taught how to, at this point I was teaching elementary school, but how to do a lot of multicultural activities to help people feel welcome, from diverse communities. And then he got up, he's a Latino gay author who you hear often on NPR. And I'm laughing because he made all of us feel so bad about what we were doing, because we were doing everything wrong for him when he was a child, and that's what teachers were doing. All he wanted to do was be accepted as an American, wear a white t-shirt and jeans and be one of the Americans, and not see his grandmother's, beautifully embroidered blouse as a, show and tell thing to show that we accepted him. So all I'm trying to say is we try so hard to help, but don't really know how to help. And that's very frustrating.
Yeah. So my church, I agree with you. Where I'm at now in Oakland, in 1969, the Black Panther Party started offering free breakfast to poor kids, and it ended up spreading around the country, and at one point was feeding 10,000 children a day. And that started at St. Augustine's, where I'm at. And so I'm reading a book on the history of the Black Panther Party, because when I looked at the index, St. Augustine's is mentioned on 8 or 10 different pages. And I was like, oh, I got to read about this. And one thing that was shocking was in 1967, their main thing was they were protesting police violence against Black people. And 53 years later in Oakland, we're still protesting the exact same thing. And so, yeah, I agree with you. We can do a lot, and it can be very discouraging. Although Angela Davis showed up at one of the protests recently, and she feels like she has hope. And so I was like, well, if she has hope, then maybe I can have a little hope. That things are kind of changing, but because she was there, 50 years ago protesting these exact same things. So
Bob has an honorary membership in the Black Panther Party. When he was at Glide Memorial, he was at CDSP doing 3 years of white Episcopalianism, and he decided he needed a little culturation, so he went to Glide for his 4th year. And he became an honorary honky.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah, and that's good. again, like racism has to do with power dynamics, right? And so someone told me there who was like a community organizer trying to protest and do all that stuff. And they said, we really love to get support from white people, but we don't want white people to be in charge. And that's like our natural inclination is to be like, oh, something's wrong. I need to help. I'm going to go be in charge.
Right.
And that's like, again, that's whiteness and white supremacy coming in and being like, well, I know better. Obviously, I'm white. So, and we wouldn't think that overtly, but it's just like, all right, I need to be in charge. And it's like, no. I need to be quiet and listen and support financially with my body, you know, all that. But yeah, I don't need to be in charge.
Yeah. I see. Thank you for sending it to the chat, Jackie. And I very much appreciate the comment that, I mean, the Episcopal Church, growing out of the legacy of Anglicanism, is, you know, de facto centered in European and white experience. And this is another area where I think we'll, as a church, you know, I don't know specifically what implications this has for Calvary, although it certainly does, that we, I think we'll be called upon to see what parts of that tradition are essential to the liturgy, and to discern where we might let go of, you know, what pieces we might let go of that we've treasured, but they provide stumbling blocks to people who would, who we might otherwise benefit from being in relationship with, you know. So, and that, I mean, we can see that with not only with people of color, but just anybody who's not familiar with the liturgy and walks in. It's a boundary. It's even more so with people for whom the language is clearly communicating a message about our European heritage and our whiteness. So.
Yeah, and as an example of that, here at St. Augustine's, after we pass the peace, whoever's having a birthday in the upcoming week comes forward, and we give them the mic. Right, that's not very Episcopalian for the priest to give someone else the mic.
I just got really nervous.
Yeah, like, you give them the mic and they can introduce themselves if they want, say how old they are and whatever. And then we sing happy birthday to everyone, and I say a little prayer. Then whoever's anniversary, come on up, give them the mic. Then we say, does anyone have a Thanksgiving to give today? Someone will raise their hand, you walk over, give them the mic. And, you know, again, none of this is very Episcopalian, but it's very Black church. And one woman in our nation, she actually, she'd get up and she'd be like, I just want to give thanks. And she'd break in a song and she'd sing a verse of, you know, how great thou art or something. We all listen and then we clap, which again is not Episcopalian, but these are all very Black church things that are part of our church. So if a bishop were to come in and witness all this and say, that's ridiculous, it's not in the prayer book, you can't do that. He's saying, basically, you have to be a white church. Anything that you're doing that comes out of your Black identity, I just need to get rid of. And it's like, these are like subtle ways where, again, we're reinforcing whiteness. So anyway.
Done that.
Yeah.
I just want to congratulate you, Jim, on learning to be flexible, for relaxing, coming out of your shell a little bit. That's great. Good for you. Good for you. I think we've got time for maybe one more question or comment. Or I think
Andrew had his
Andrew, yeah, go ahead.
Jim, thank you for the comments. And I want to applaud you for wearing those torn up jeans underneath that we can't see in the Zoom thing right now.
I don't dress that way anymore. My wife wouldn't let me.
And for synchronizing your shirt with Jay. It was well done. So I work with a equity and social justice focused not-for-profit. And like all not-for-profits, we have a board of directors. Our board of directors has changed in its demographic very intentionally over the past 5-6 years, but it still skews white, male, and pretty much so close to the age of 80. And some of those fine folks who have benefited from 5-6 decades of real privilege, and they acknowledge it, are at the same time now turning to folks of my generation and younger and saying, as a white male, you just need to shut up and listen. I find some conflict there where my colleagues and friends of color, particularly African-American colleagues and friends, say, sometimes I need you actually to do the talking. So you had made a comment earlier, akin to, but different than. Would you mind speaking about, in your experience, and again, it's yours, in your parish and in your life, but when and where is it time to shut up and listen? And when and where is it time to perhaps speak up? And when is it like, I'm not sure, it's time to ask, right?
Yeah, no, that is a fantastic question. I have some great, that's a really great question. I'll tell you a couple stories. So when I was in that diocese, Western North Carolina, I was on the Commission to Dismantle Racism. And we met and had a retreat and all stuff. And then we had our first meeting with Bishop Jose after he was elected. And we're all sitting there and Bishop Jose was like, I just want to hear what's going on with this committee. Well, the meeting with the bishop is important. So the first 3 people to talk were white people. And I was like, no, you need to shut up. Like, this is there are black people here and this is a commission to dismantle racism. But it was like they couldn't help themselves, right? It's like the bishop's here, I gotta impress the bishop. So I gotta be the first one to talk. It's like, no, Bill Mance or his wife need to be the first ones to talk, right? If you know Bill, he's fantastic. I can't remember his wife's name, but she's probably even better than Bill. But anyway.
And she is, yeah.
Yeah, she is. So that's an instance where it's like, I'm on a committee to help black people and the important person shows up. I don't need to be the first one to talk, right? But then if I'm in a group situation with my wife and someone says something racist or semi-racist or whatever, I don't always need to make her be the one to address it, right? In fact, she needs me to speak up and just be like, no, stop saying that's racist. Does that make sense? So we don't always want black people to have to do the work of addressing racism. And when you're in a position of power, let the black people speak. So I think those 2 examples, I think, kind of show, I think that answers your question. So, yeah.
And I'll say, I mean, that's part of the intention with this series, at least so far. All of the folks who we've been having conversations with are white people. And that is in order not to put the burden on black people to explain things which they have to live with all the time. It has been correctly pointed out to me that all of the guests so far have been white men, you know, and that's a fair criticism, and gives me an opportunity to plug our next session, which will be with Catherine Floyd, who is the director of the Zebulon Vance home place historical site in Buncombe County, Zebulon Vance being the Civil War governor of Buncombe County. And she's thought quite a bit and done a lot of work on how we understand the past being shaped by our present, and reframing our stories about the past based on both the current circumstance of our society and new information that comes to light, or information that had been that had never been buried but just hadn't been included in the story. So she's going to talk with us about this idea of forming collective memory and how we do that, and how that serves our community, how that shapes our common life, and so forth. So that'll be in 2 weeks, on the, I guess it's the 29th of July. So we look forward to that conversation. And I want to say thanks again to Jim for being willing to do this, for joining us for this. We're very grateful for your presence and for your ministry. And just kind of offer you the last word, just to say, we started, you mentioned just a little bit about Angela Davis and seeing hope. What in this conversation feeds you spiritually? Where do you find hope in this conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I first joined the Commission to Dismantle Racism, I think I went to a session in like 2015. And between then and now, it feels like the questions we white people are asking have gotten a lot better, a lot less defensive. And it's like a lot of people are a lot more willing to have these conversations. Now, there's still people who aren't going to go to a commission to dismantle racism, but it's like the people, at least the people showing up, like the base level of awareness is like a lot higher than it was. And so that's really encouraging. Yeah,
That's great.
that's been really great, that it's like, in part, I'm doing this work because I married a Black woman, because I'm a priest to Black people, and I've kind of chosen that path, right? But it's encouraging that a lot of you folks are just looking at the news and you're like, this is messed up, and America's pretty racist, or a lot more racist than I ever would have thought. And just from that, we're all kind of waking up and just willingly like, yeah, we need to figure this out and do something about it as white people. That's really
right. Well, thank you for taking part in this, and thank you all for being here. This has been recorded, so we'll put it up on our Facebook, on our YouTube channel, and share it that way as well. So if there's somebody that you didn't see here who you think you'd like to share this with, stay tuned, because that'll be available. So thanks, and good night. Good night, everyone. Stay
Bye-bye.
well.
good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Amen.
Thanks, Jim.